for anybody who wants to like see the subtitles. As well, we'll be putting up all the information in like a follow-up email. So if you have any questions or want to reach out, please contact us through there.
So the interesting part of the event with the panel is coming up next. We want to first spotlight all of our panelists. We have 5. One is coming a little bit late because they have to finish a course. That's Professor Shallow. But for right now, we're going to spotlight our 4 panelists, Dr. Isaac, Dr. Lee, Tam Rovito, and Mi-Hyun Yoon. Right. Hello, everyone. It's great to see you all, your big faces. Okay. So we'll get started with the first question. We're going to ask this to all of you, but we wanted to point this question first to Tam. We want to know, what is your experience identifying as an APIDA individual within Rutgers or without, your background, your experience growing up and to your adulthood?
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Again, I'm Tam Rovito. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a bit about me. I work at Rutgers at the Counseling Center as a clinician there, and I am also a graduate student in the doctoral program at the School of Social Work. And I'm also a Rutgers undergrad alum. So I feel like Rutgers just kind of like flows in my body. So my experience identifying as an APIDA, I think it has changed over the years. I think as a younger person, I didn't really seem to place a lot of emphasis on my identity as an APIDA woman until I would say like undergraduate years, where I got to Rutgers as a quite diverse community, because when I did my elementary school, it wasn't as diverse. So until I got to Rutgers that I felt like, oh, I need to figure out who I am, where I belong, who do I belong with, and where is it that I felt most belong and embraced. So I think exploring different areas of my identity has been a journey. And I think even now as a professional at Rutgers, and then becoming a graduate student again at Rutgers, it has been an interesting process. And I think to me, it really is a journey, is what I would say. And Rutgers is one of those places where, regardless of where you are in that process, there's always resources and places and people that you can connect with for support, and or just to, figure out, what do you think about this? How have you been impacted by everything that's been going on? That's what I would say and start with for now.
Thank you, Tam. We would love to hear more about your journey in the upcoming questions. I'd like to turn this question to Professor Isaac to hear about his background as well as his experience identifying as APIDA.
Sure. Again, thank you, Jillian. Thank you, Emily. And thank you, everyone who has organized and organized all these important conversations throughout this month. And it's been really important this year, obviously, for all our communities. And I teach rather at the SAS American Studies department, as well as the English department. So I'm a faculty there. I also specialize in Asian American literature and cultural studies. And just to echo Tam, I think that's absolutely right. I think my identification with Asian American has been shifting throughout the years. I grew up in Jersey City, so that's actually very different in a sense of, because it is a plurality. So I didn't actually think of myself as Asian American. I thought of myself as Filipino. Why? Because there were so many Filipinos. Having such a large Filipino community means that you can't hide anything from anyone's business. So everyone actually knows everyone's family in different ways, and that was good and bad, obviously, because there are always, it's a double-edged sword whenever you actually grow up in a big Filipino or other ethnic communities, and so there was a plurality there. But it is true that I did not necessarily identify, like many Filipinos, some of them, many Filipinos actually don't necessarily identify as Asian American as such, but I actually identified with friends who are Puerto Rican, because there's a big Puerto Rican population in Jersey City. So since we had similar names, ate similar food, shared some words, et cetera, it was really in college and, well, in high school, where I went to a boys' Catholic high school where it was actually predominantly Italian and Irish. And that's when I saw myself as absolutely different, because it was no longer a plurality like Jersey City. And certainly that I went to a very, very white dominant school in New England for undergrad. And that's when it was forced upon me. in a sense, to actually identify as Asian American and as be part of a coalition that actually really pushed for what we understood then as multicultural education. We don't use that word as much. We've now replaced it with something called diversity. And I think it really has shifted in different ways. And we can actually go, each one was always a double-edged sword, of course. And I think we can talk more about that later.
Thank you, Professor Isaac. I know I personally, as well as other members of ASC, and I'm sure the audience can relate to having that awakening when it comes to being in education and being surrounded by new people and having those new experiences. Professor Lee, would you like to comment on that? Would you like to share your background and your experiences as an APIDA individual?
Sure, thank you. I just want to echo what Tam and Professor Isaac has already said, that just to thank Jillian, Emily, and the other organizers for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Rick Lee. I'm the Director of Global Programs at Rutgers Global, the international office here at the university. I've been in this role for about 6 years now. I have to do a little calculation. But I also spent 6 years from 2009 to 2015 as the coordinator of Asian American Studies programming for the Department of American Studies. So I'm really glad that this conversation is reemerging again with a group of dynamic students this year. Like Tam, I'm also an alumnus twice of Rutgers. I did my master's and one of my master's and my PhD here. So I've been here for the last 23 years, and I came for grad school and things have just stayed the same. So in terms of the question, I have learned, I'm ethnically Chinese. I've learned to embrace my Chineseness in different ways. I was actually born in Jakarta, Indonesia. As some of you may know, there's a fairly substantial group of ethnic Chinese living in Indonesia with a very complicated history. But I didn't really fully understand what it meant to be Chinese until I moved to Canada, ironically. So I didn't learn to speak Cantonese or Toisanese, more specifically with my grandmother, until I moved to Canada. I actually didn't even learn how to use chopsticks until I moved to Canada. So my Chineseness was definitely developed when I moved to Canada, but in Canada, some of you may know, is a completely different kind of society. It's a more kind of multicultural society where differences are embraced. So it's more like a cultural mosaic as opposed to a melting pot idea here in the US. But I also have learned to embrace my Chinese Canadian identity when I moved to the US, in the sense that the US has a very specific history of social justice movements, the emergence of ethnic studies. These are both kind of absent in Canada. So there's some, even though there's some benefits of living in a kind of a multicultural, cultural mosaic society in Canada, there's also some very distinct advantages of growing up in the US and having a kind of a distinct history of social justice movements and ethnic studies. So, and I think that what I also want to commend us, and hopefully we'll have a time to also address the name of this panel. I really want to hear from the organizers. I think the idea of breaking down is so crucial in the sense of the need to sort of disaggregate as a way to really figure out the differences among this collectivity and also to gather together other as well. So I hope we'll get a chance to think about the title as well as a guiding metaphor for this conversation.
Thank you, Professor Lee. You definitely highlighted some of the topics that I promise we'll get into in a little bit. But last, but certainly not least, I am so excited to have Mihyun on this panel. Please tell us about your background and your experience identifying as APIDA.
Thank you so much, Jillian. And first, of course, I'd like to echo everyone else in thanking you as well as Emily and rest of the organizers on the Asian Student Council for hosting this important event. And I'm also honored to be on a panel with Dr. Isaac and Dr. Lee, who have been so instrumental to the Asian American Studies Initiative back when I was an undergrad student at Rutgers College, actually. My year was the last graduating year of Rutgers College, and then continuing on since then. And Professor Shallow, who will be joining us later, he was actually my undergrad mentor at the time. So all of my, sort of faculty, I guess, connections kind of coalescing at this point here. So I'm very honored to be here. So I had a lot of similar experiences with Dr. Isaac, I want to say. So I grew up in New Jersey. I was born in South Korea, but immigrated here at a young age, like six or seven, six, I believe. Actually, no, it is six because my father drove me back home. I was home because I had to get the second dose of my vaccine. My father drove me just before this started, and he was reminding me of how it's been 26 years since we've been in this country, and will be 27 years going in after today's passed. So I grew up in North Jersey, where there's a lot of Korean Americans. Although I didn't really identify with everyone else at the time, considering that my family was not religious, we didn't go to church. So despite the fact that, like my mom makes her own kimchi, she still does to this day. We have, if you know the urns, right? The pottery with the jar, and then it's buried in the ground. Like we have all of that. But given that I didn't go to church and most of my friends, I guess, for that reason, were not Korean. I guess I identified as Korean, but not in a particular type of Korean. And it wasn't until I got to Rutgers as an undergrad that I started to see myself more as Korean, more as APIDA, and working on the Asian American Initiative helped. And it was like the first time where I could actually take classes on things like the Asian American experience, Asian American history. And I think while it's lacking, and I know we all want more, I didn't realize how good New Brunswick campus was until I got to Newark campus. As was mentioned, I'm a doctoral student, but on the Newark campus for American Studies. And I've told several people this, that I've actually never felt such like a minority until I was actually on the Newark campus. And that's because while there is quote unquote diversity, it's diversity that amplifies certain colors and certain voices over others. So on a regular basis, I would say I face sort of like microaggression-y type of things, where I would go to grad school and I'm a US citizen, but the first thing they ask, because of my name and because of how I look, will be, are you an international student? Things like this. So that is to say, while yes, we're fighting for more, and of course we should fight for more on the New Brunswick campus, I think it's great that the things that you have, it can be had because of all the work that's undergrad students, your seniors, and also of course Dr. Isaac, Dr. Lee, and of course G, who's here in the audience, Asian American Student Council, Asian Student Council, as well as the Asian American Student Cultural Center. All of these things have been like worked on for such a long time that you have all of these things. So let's not forget about that as well.
Of course, you make a really great point about making sure that the work that we do is able to be translated to other populations and other groups who want it, who are eager for it. With that, I will turn to Emily for the next question.
Yes, so thank you so much for giving us so much insight into your backgrounds and into your experience as Asian Americans. I guess kind of moving then on to the idea of APIDA identity. Our first question would be, what factors do you think affect an APIDA person's association to their ethnicity and culture? Obviously, some of you have shared already, how you've kind of grow up in the US and kind of how that's colored like your experience with being Asian American. How do you think your identity has been formed, and how do you think in general Asian American identity is formed? Oh yeah, anyone can answer, or whoever feels comfortable to answer.
I'll just jump in very quickly. And the way that I think all of us have answered very differently from our locales, it is very regional and very specific as far as our proximity to other people of color and also how dominant whiteness was where we grew up. And I think, as I said before, Jersey City was a plurality, and my identification as a Filipino was with Puerto Ricans rather than with other Asian groups. So I think that's very localized. But so we enter this category, Asian American, as a very sort of conscious and intentional act, political and social act ourselves. And I think that also shows our commitments in the way that we are committed to Asian American as a category about social justice. So let me just end there.
I think I can add to that a little bit. I think what we're discussing is not only kind of the geographical specificity, but also the historical context and specificity as well. And I see Tam nodding her head. So one of the things I found really, really amazing and inspiring with all the students that I've taught and the students who are in the audience now is how much you're really embracing this kind of identity at such a young age. And I think that for myself, and I don't think it's just because I moved from Indonesia to Canada at a young age, but I do think that there's particular kinds of identities, or for those of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s, that there was still a kind of shame attached to an ethnic identity, that we were less ready to embrace that, whether it's through a kind of rejection of the food, a kind of a disavowal of needing to learn particular languages. So just to add on to what Professor Isaac said, so it's not just the geographical specificity, but also the historical context in which we all grew up as well.
Yes, thank you for that. I think the historical context for me is one of the major things that shape how I view my identity. So I identify as Vietnamese American and a refugee. So when I came to this country at a young age, the only thing I've ever heard, right? So my family's huge and we talk about the Vietnam War and the impact that has on our family. But when I see how the media portray the war, there's a dissonance there. And then how the Vietnamese women are portrayed in those contexts are very different than how I see my family. I'm one of 5 girls, right? My mom have always raised us to like be able to do whatever to break down gender barriers and all of that. And then to see the way that I'm supposed to be according to media in the US, that had really made me feel like, no, I'm gonna fight and I'm gonna be this strong APIDA person who I'm not going to fall into the stereotype. So I think the historical context, it's made a big difference in my identity.
And if I could just add one more thing, it's like the different categories that I think Rick and Tam had pointed to, refugee, immigrant, and I want to add H-1B sort of workers that have come into New Jersey in particular. Really these are all Asian, can fall under Asian American, because these are all very different historical and psychic experience of what it means to be an Asian American. And that's why it becomes sort of very varied and diverse. And that somehow this sort of like category that people mistake as a racial category rather than an intentional choice of people to be under Asian American gets erased, right? That they see it as a racial category and therefore also then, gets mounted into this notion of model minority. But no, refugees did not have a choice necessarily. H-1B people were also came here precisely because of their high skill and high paying sort of like abilities and potentialities rather. So these are all very, very different approaches at entry into the American society and the way we contest and have to negotiate our identities with it.
Thank you all for touching on such personal experiences as well as shining light on our other allies and other members of our community. I'd like to take a second to introduce our next panelist, Professor Shallow. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm sorry to be late, but I just finished my class.
No worries, no worries. You're just in time, actually. We love to hear about your background as well as your involvement at Rutgers and how specifically your association with your ethnicity and your upbringing have shaped your identity as an individual.
Yeah, well, that's a huge subject. And it's hard to keep it short, but I will try. Um, I wanted to say that, even though you looking at me, you obviously know I'm not Asian, that I wanted to talk about the ways, that life experience is not always obvious the way, your ethnicity is based on your genetics. And so my background is that my parents worked in China from 1947 to 1951 during the period of the revolution in 1949. And I have a sister who was born there who died and is buried in China. And I have a brother who was born there in China. And then my parents were, had to leave. And I was born after they got back to the States. But I spent my first birthday on a boat in the Panama Canal, believe it or not, on my way to Taiwan. And my parents worked there from when I was age 1 until I was age 3. And there's a saying in Japanese, Mitsugo no tamashi hyakumade. And a loose translation would be, the person you are at age 3 is the person you are till you're 100. In other words, it's the very young years when you're shaped. And I always reflect on that because my brother was 2 years older than me and seemed to have been less impacted by those years in Taiwan. But for me, it's kind of taken me a lifetime to realize how deeply shaped I was by it. When I was 18, I went as an exchange student to Japan, and I had this eerie feeling of returning home. And it wasn't until later that I realized I probably felt comfortable there because that was deeply part of me, even before I have real memories. So I just wanted to say that, the Asian American community has allies like me without Asian background. And we're huge supporters of your goals. And I wanted to just share that, my knowledge of Asia from my very earliest years makes me, I think, come to these questions with a lot of sympathy and understanding of your positions.
Thank you so much, Professor Shallow, for sharing that intimate piece about yourself with us. I think that brings us to our next question that we have for all of you about how the common struggles that APIDA individuals face, they're unique. They're based on our own ethnicities as well as our perceived races. We want to know, how have these struggles developed, and how do you think that these struggles, whether it being involved completely in a culture, but not sharing the same ethnicity of those people in that culture, or not feeling like you deserve to be a participant in that culture, how have these things translated into other aspects of APIDA lives, whether it be their careers, their relationships? And I'd like to first direct this question to Tam.
I feel like that's like a loaded question. So I'm trying to figure out where can I start. I think for me, I would start from the area that I know best is mental health. I think mental health within the Asian community, the APIDA community, I think 20 years ago when I started graduate school to now has not shifted that much. Unfortunately, I think there's still such a lack of clinicians who identify within the APIDA community. There's a huge need for us because of the stigma, because of the lack of access. Most of us don't have the language to know that we're not just sad or angry or happy, right? There's a range of emotions in between. And also because we are such a diverse group of people, with such different experiences that sometimes traumatic experiences come into play. Racial trauma is very real within the APIDA community as well, as we talked earlier with immigrants, refugee, and I think for me, that has been a piece that really led me to want to go back to school to get my doctorate, because I've been a practicing clinician going on 20 years and not much has changed. And I need to change the literature. I need to change the scholarship and also representation. I think as a clinical social worker, I believe there's only 1% of all clinical social workers that identify as APIDA. And we service such a large group of APIDA folks. So I think for me, mental health is one of those areas that that we still have some room to make, movement in.
Thank you so much, Tam. I think we can definitely attest to that. And we've seen the rise in anti-Asian violence, how that's affected all of us as a community and also individually. It's been very difficult to process crisis after crisis. And I'm sure that in combination with what we've seen with the pandemic and how all of these factors intermingle, it's no surprise that our mental health at this time is not the best. I'd like to point this question to Professor Lee to see how, if he knows, if you'd like to share what his experiences have been with individuals who are identifying as APIDA but are international students status. How has that identity as an APIDA individual seen struggles when it comes to coming to Rutgers, being that extra layer of different compared to the majority of students?
Thank you, Jillian. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously. I think one of the goals that our office tries to reach is providing resources and programming that can help the integration of our international students with our domestic students. And we do that in various ways with different kinds of successes. I think that one of the main challenges for some of our international students who may predominantly come from China, from India, is the kind of need to sort of be around other people like them. So it's that comforting side, impulse. I think we can all identify with that, but also to encourage them to sort of also branch out a little bit outside of that. And I think from having worked with G for the last number of, I won't date ourselves, but for a lot of years, I really applaud G's consistent efforts to really include international students as part of the AACC culture so that they can be the ambassadors themselves to other international students as well. So I think that's really, really quite important. I also wanted just to talk more generally, Jillian, to address your point. Tam touched on mental health. And I also want to just think about, what the other struggles that students face, especially our students, is pursuing studies and with the idea of a career in mind, right? So I think that for many students, especially APIDA identified students, really balancing between pursuing studies or major or a future career that is acceptable, whether it's prescribed by parental or societal expectations, and your own kinds of interests. And I've heard this and experienced this with many, many students as well. So I applaud those students who are really pursuing what they want to pursue, even at the risk of not being accepted or understood by their parents. And I think that's really a courageous move to make. And I think that's something that you will always have to think about as well in terms of how you navigate your own career choices after graduation. But that's always sort of one of the things that I think about our students really facing those very real challenges. Do I want to pursue this because I'm interested in this, but will it get me a certain kind of job that will earn the respect of my family or my parents or my guardians or my community? So.
Professor Isaac, please go. Please go.
No, I did want to echo Rick's and Tam's ideas about to combine sort of mental health. And really, it is true that I think mental health is so needed in our multiple communities, precisely because the language is not there. It's not necessarily part of our immigrant community or familial language of seeking help. Help is, is not allowed in a sense, because then it also is a sign of failure in many communities. So the idea of people, and I do have to credit the Asian American Cultural Center providing the space that is not marked or stigmatized, that I know Tam is there, very consistently to just have a talk. And that's all it is, a talk. And really it's a space for yourself, and also for others and your peers to actually, quote unquote, be yourself beyond the pressures of family expectations. Because there's always the fantasy of our parents. And I've had to lie during my undergrad years. I was doing theater and political science, right? Why? Because political science is pretending that I'm going to be a lawyer. Theater, I really liked, or any of the arts. And so doubling like that was always a way to actually make a space for myself and, quote unquote, make my parents happy as well as myself. But that's hard because it takes a lot of time to do two things at once and having two lives and not being allowed to actually live those lives at the same time. And that, again, if you fail that trajectory or if you veer away from that trajectory, that's a mark of failure. And we don't have a language for that because it's not acceptable, because it's just a disappointment or shame in that sense. So.
You bring up some very valid points about what it is like to be a student, to be in higher education, having those choices. I'd like to turn this question to Mi-hyun to see what she was experienced and also what she's seen when it comes to seeing APIDA students seeking those opportunities in graduate school and higher education beyond the undergraduate degree.
Well, that's a lot of questions that I was not expecting, but it's interesting that you asked that question, and I'm on a campus that is, so on the Newark campus, it's all STEM PhD programs except for American Studies, right? So but then all things considered, I haven't seen more APIDA students compared to New Brunswick either. So I think it doesn't necessarily say anything about like more APIDA students are on this campus because it's more STEM or anything like that. I will say, I think there have been more international students, I think on the Newark campus that I've seen who I do identify as APIDA, but I think it's also it's unique to the Newark campus in the sense that it's like people see Asians overall as either like they're not considered in the sense because as part of the sort of like diversity conversation, they're looked at as white, right? So people are like, they're doing fine, not necessarily like you don't need to have another discussion about them, or they're just looked at as international. So there's no actual like grounds for me to be a person who identifies as Asian American. So I think that's something that I do want to mention. But in terms of like the overall question that you've been asking, I was thinking that in terms of like, so my research deals with, politics and activism and such. And I think that there's a misconception that's definitely fueled by media narratives, right? In the sense that Asian Americans, APIDA, are not political, right? We're seen as sort of like the model silent minority who doesn't get involved, we're not engaged. So that's something that I think people have to fight back on. And also because of that, I think as like what we've seen late in the media lately is the fact that elderly Asian folks get beaten by other people of color, right? But the situation is playing up the fact that there's rifts between different peoples of color rather than the fact that actually there's been long histories of people of color having unified movements against things like white supremacy, things like imperialism, and right. So these are sort of the things that kind of get hidden due to current existing media narratives that, I mean, hopefully with my research, it's some of the things that I try to, bring to light to say that this is actually not the case. And I think that part of the reason that politics gets hidden too within the US sort of societal like media narrative is the fact that the definition of what Asians sort of see as politics kind of it expands beyond what we see as politics simply in the sense of electoral politics, right? Because they are involved in sort of overseas politics that have both impact in their homeland, but as well as their identity here on the ground. Let's say as Korean American, I do research on Korean Americans, so that's what that's the example that I'm going to use here. And people don't see that because they think that, oh, they're not participating in American politics, they're just doing whatever, and that's actually absolutely not true. So I just definitely wanted to highlight that.
Thank you so much, Mian, for sharing your background and your experience with what it's like trying to pursue higher education as an APIDA individual. I kind of also like to highlight what some of the other participants have said, especially Professor Isaac, what you mentioned about like how it's so difficult pursuing like specifically what type of education you want when you face sort of like these internalized pressures and these external pressures, both cultural and individually as an APIDA individual, sort of pursuing the education that you want. So kind of moving off of our conversation about APIDA identity, we'd like to start asking questions about Rutgers specifically and how the departments and how Rutgers can sort of contribute to this conversation. So our first question on this sort of piece is, how has your department specifically, or your office, or your major, or whatever ways in which you interact with students at Rutgers, sort of address the needs of APIDA students, especially in terms of personal growth, in terms of opportunity, and in terms of cultural celebration? In what ways do you see your department or office sort of contribute to these conversations? I'd like to address this to Professor Shallow first, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll be happy to address that because I'm chair of Asian Languages and Cultures, and that department really is a product to a great extent of exactly the kind of advocacy that we're seeing today from the student groups on campus. And I know one of your goals is programmatic development, and looking at our program and language study and culture classes, I almost am embarrassed to admit that I've been at Rutgers more than 30 years. In fact, they celebrate your longevity with like a party at 10, 20, and 30. And when I celebrated 30, I think Professor Isaac was celebrating his 10th year. So it shows, I'm a lot further along in age-wise. But in my time here, I have seen the Korean program go from nothing to what it is today, because the Korean student groups on campus said, hey, look, New Jersey has a big demographic. We're the State University of New Jersey. Let's do something about it. And the Korean business community backed that up with, funds that helped us get off the ground. And now we have a really dynamic and well-integrated Korean program. And I think it was around 2014 that we started Filipino, in large part because the Filipino student community said, we want to study our heritage language. And so we were able to hire a PTL to do that. And a couple years later after that, we started offering Vietnamese because of that input from students. And so it's really important to our department and the university to be responsive to those voices. But I have to say, it's a long, time-consuming job. And, whatever goals you have for programming, you have to think long range. And that's why I think it's so important to put it in the hands of your professors who really believe in you guys and in your goals, because we're going to be here, more than, say, 4 years, like most of the students. We're the ones who hear what you're saying and can, help turn it into an infrastructure for the education here at Rutgers that will last for generations, hopefully. So in my 30 years, I was only the second hire in Japanese, and the Chinese program had preceded the establishment of the Japanese program by about 10 years. It was set up in 1966. So it's been around 55 years. But where you look at us today, we're a faculty of 18 people in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean programs with like 20 PTLs teaching all these heritage languages. We want to grow, and your input and advocacy is so important. But I also want to say that with advocacy comes responsibility. It's well known that students are moving away from humanities courses. So it's really hard for us to advocate. Take our, say, culture courses in Japanese, Chinese, Korean, if we don't have, enrollments. So I want to say, take one for the team, take one humanities course in Asian humanities for the team. And I think that'll help us grow. That's for me, a really almost day-to-day a message that I want to send out to everybody.
Thank you so much. And for sort of giving us like that spark of hope, I suppose, with that story about how Korean students sort of moved up from the student level up into like creating a program that we could still benefit from today. It really puts it into perspective, kind of the ways that we look at things, because as students now, we only have a limited amount of time at Rutgers. But I suppose as professors and as administration at Rutgers, it seems like you have a much more time in comparison, or you could see these movements from their infancy up until like they grow up into like these very broad programs. As well, I suppose like we'll be talking about a bit more about it later, but kind of moving on to like how the student population get more involved in contributing to this conversation and in contributing to initiatives that include more Asian American heritage. We'll of course be talking about that later. I also kind of wanted to ask Professor Isaac a bit about your experience teaching really Asian American focused courses at Rutgers in both the American Studies Department and at the English Department.
Thank you so much. And I absolutely agree with Professor Shallow. It's like in the way that there has to be the synergy between students and then professors and administrators every generation. And each generation of students actually pushes it further. It really builds on each other. And I think that's really important. And I know you and Jillian are really looking at sort of the pipeline and the longevity of it. And that's always been, of course, the problem with each generation of students, but fear not. But precisely because each one always builds on the next one. So first, and there was, in fact, a whole, and I'm sure you know about the history of actually students have actually gathered together in a coalition and sent like this big, a proposal to the big dean and to the president back in 2009, and then again in 2011. And so it is because of that force, right? Students have more power than they actually think they do, because the more that you actually work together and that your voices are heard, the more they will listen. And it actually gives us the possibility for those of us who actually want exactly the same things that you do about programs, working together through, American studies and Asian languages and culture, especially in the East Coast, by the way. In particular, in the East Coast, usually Asian American and Asian studies programs tend to work together to create an Asian American program in the East Coast, historically speaking. But historically, nationwide, it is always because of students and student advocacy and student movements that have moved, these things to have institutional investments. People just won't give you things. You really have to demand and ask for it every year, like every year. And that's why it's so important. That's why it was possible to get a race and ethnic studies minor in American studies in 2011. And then of course, with the great hard work of Rick Lee and G. Lee for the Asian American Cultural Center, we were able to get, a living learning community. We were able to offer particular classes that is focused on, Asian American issues. It was important, so far I know, and you guys have researched it, I think there's only 3 or 4 courses that are titled Asian American. Now, it is also true that there's some Asian American courses in School of Arts and Sciences that might be embedded in like immigration history, let's say. So let's make that 10. So the point is, it's still very limited. But it is important to actually keep that in mind. And I think you're absolutely right. Rhetorically speaking, you're right. There's only 3 on the books that say so. And it is a struggle, but there is a lot of us actually, a number of us actually, Sylvia Chan Malik, who works on Islam in America. We also have Andy Urban, who works on 19th century immigration in comparing sort of African-American, Japanese, Chinese and Japanese labor, for example. And then there's also, of course, working with the Asian languages and culture, we had the Asian American Studies certificate, which I know we're actually growing to a minor, I think, which will be approved very soon, probably in the next week or so. And then, of course, I know ALC is working on their own Asian Studies minor, which is focused on the culture courses. So it's very, very important, or major, sorry, it's a major. And this is sort of like really great touchstones that I think these are the institutional investments that we can grow and from which, student demand can actually be met as well.
And if I can add from a non-academic side, so we at AACC, when I first started 2013-ish, we didn't have anyone at AACC. So I remember I used to come and visit, and it was like 2 hours a week. That's all we got. And now we have Yushi, who's there 2 days a week, which again, I don't think that's enough. And at the same time, if students continue to use Yushi when Yushi is there, then the demand and the need will be there for us to potentially have more staff to potentially be at AACC for a full-time staff person instead of being split. So I think definitely the student advocacy is effective on the student affairs and student services side as well.
Right. Thank you so much, both of you, for your insight into sort of the academic and and especially for what CAPS can do for students. I think that's very invaluable, especially with, recent events, and especially with sort of how we can motivate like these initiatives on a student level. I suppose then passing it on, I'll move it on to like Jill with the next question about what we can do further for Rutgers.
Thank you, Emily. So we wanted to pose to all of you, based on your personal experiences and your opinions and what you've seen throughout the years. We all know that you've been established here for a significant, recognizable amount of time. We want to know what you think about how Rutgers can institutionally benefit from all of these initiatives and advocacy that APIDA students are participating in now. What does Rutgers stand to benefit from an Asian American Studies major and minor, a department, an Asian Studies major in Professor Shallow's department? What about the APIDA community nationally? We want to know, what do you hope comes out of these initiatives and endeavors? Whether it's more community, more engagement, more awareness. What do you think? And this question is to anybody, if they want to jump in.
May I jump in? To answer that, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is Asian Studies for, or who is it for? And one approach is, well, it's for the Asian American community to understand their heritage better. But I always feel that our target should really be everybody else. They're the ones who need to know more about Asia and Asian studies. So I want to keep in mind that Asian American studies should not be kind of a defined for a specific community, but for essentially the broader community, because that's where knowledge and education is possibly missing. And how to make that happen, again, I think it falls to some extent on our Asian American and Asian international students themselves to, generate interest in your non-Asian classmates to, want to study some of these things. I think pop culture has been a great intro for certain, parts of Asian, what would you call it, a culture and activity. A lot of students come into the Korean program or the Japanese program with an interest in pop culture. So I like to think that every community has something that can hook people from the broader community. And I'd like all of us to think about what those hooks are and how to develop them so that we can bring in more people to, these Asian or Asian American courses.
Let me just add as well to what Professor Shallow has mentioned. I do think that Asian American studies and Asian studies would benefit a large number of students from taking those classes. And I think that advocacy for the students in the audience, advocacy comes in many forms. It comes definitely in the kind of making demands for these courses, but I also want to reinforce what Professor Shallow meant. Advocacy is also enrolling in those classes so that our numbers are there. I think that's really, really very, very important. As to the question that's raised in terms of what does Rutgers stand to benefit from the formation of Asian American Studies as a discipline here at Rutgers, I think that for Asian American Studies to be here and to kind of a growing of Asian studies will contribute to kind of a true diversity that Rutgers is always boasting about, right? And this is diversity in knowledge, knowledge formations, and who has access to particular bodies of knowledge. And it will actually help to contribute to what President Holloway calls our beloved community, where everyone does feel a sense of belonging and people have access to their own histories and others' histories as well. In addition, I also think that Rutgers does benefit to enhance its own standing as a Research One institution, and in particular among the other Big Ten schools. One of the things that's, there's lots of faculty who are really teaching very interesting courses here, and a lot of the courses are really based on their research. I think what the faculty are also wanting is not only undergraduate students to take their classes, but what faculty are really wanting as well are graduate students who they can then train into the pipeline for future academics. That's always going to be an important goal as well. So I think that Rutgers benefits in many, many ways from for the institutionalization of Asian American studies here. So kudos to all the students who are encouraging that conversation.
And I want to just, again, the simple answer to echo Professor Shallow and Rick Lee's point is that it is for everyone, right? And I'm wondering if we need to use the word benefit, but rather see it as an obligation. It is a university obligation. It is a university obligation to the demographics of New Jersey. It is also a university obligation for actually expanding our knowledge. We are responsible for actually accounting for people's histories. There is no doubt that the histories of people of color, in fact, created the United States in the way we understand being American right now, in all its problems, right? The immigrant was invented because of the Asian, because Asians were banned, right? If you're gonna ban somebody, you actually have to have borders and you actually have to have enforcements to make sure that they don't come in. That's right, the immigrant was invented and the border was invented because of Asian Americans and later to become Asian Americans, right? So it really is about an obligation, I think, to the knowledge that we're supposed to be responsible for, to actually then expand our understanding of what America means. And I think that's really important, rather than saying, and it's like, how do we benefit you? No, you are obligated to, in fact, deliver this to us. Thank you.
Professor Isaac. Oh, Mihyun, would you like to
Yeah,
comment on that?
I just wanted to echo really quickly too that I really agree with the idea that it is an obligation, as Dr. Isaac said, and of course Dr. Lee and Dr. Shallow, said great things too. But I think it's so important in the sense that, again, I'm going to speak related to Korea because that's my research area. Like, we have things like the Korean War and the current issue with North Korea and the US because it is a creation of it's like a creation of US's own fault, right? The fact that two random state officials who had absolutely no knowledge about Korea decided to randomly draw a parallel line to divide the peninsula into two that's why things like the Korean War happened. That's why things like the ongoing issue with North Korea continue to happen, right? Because of the fact that people are not equipped. They don't know the knowledge of the people and the history of the people that are that are outside of US and outside of its barriers. They don't borders. They don't know what's going on. And I'm sure everyone has heard this joke about, what do you call a person who speaks three languages? Trilingual. What do you call someone who speaks two languages? They're bilingual. And what do you call someone who only speaks one language? They're American, right? And so it's these things where there's so much room for growth, and Rutgers not only does Rutgers have an obligation to offer that, right, to the residents of New Jersey, so that the students who attend Rutgers can grow up to be outstanding citizens of not only New Jersey but the world, and they, as future leaders, they can make impactful decisions, right, that benefit not only themselves but everyone in the world. And I think that's why it's so important that Asian American studies exist as well as Asian studies exist.
Thank you, Mihyun and Professor Isaac, for both sharing that perspective. I'd like to expand upon that a little bit, in that I think this also goes back to what we were saying previously about the breaking down the APIDA term, the idea that there are so many distinct cultures and histories, and the idea that we are all lumped together and one degree program is enough to satisfy everyone and appease the voices of rebellion and revolting. That's not enough. You both make very good points about how the university has an obligation. It's not something that is for the university to profit off of. It's something that is expected. So I just wanted to definitely echo you two in that aspect, and that breaking down APIDA identity is what we're here for. It's essential that we all are distinct, but we're all together and we're all community. But we're also able to acknowledge where our differences are, and celebrate our similarities, but also celebrate our differences. This brings us to our next question, which I'd love to hand over to Emily.
Yes, of course. I mean, this is probably our final question, just so that we don't run over too much time. I love all of the information, and I know personally I've learned so much from what everybody has said so far. I found it really enriching and really important that we have these discussions, and that we interact with people like you in ways that really inform like our worldview. So I guess our final question is sort of how students or how individuals in the audience can sort of get involved in really pursuing or really motivating APIDA student-run initiatives and programs. So I know in particular, Professor Isaac and Dr. Lee, you have had a real stake in supporting the Asian American Studies Initiative in the past decade or so. So if you'd like to speak on it, we'd love that. But if anybody else has like any more information or anything else that they'd like to share in particular to this question, that would be great as well. So in what ways would you recommend students who are interested in APIDA issues or allies participate in this movement at Rutgers? And what future steps should students and organizations take in order to sort of support this idea of greater diversity at Rutgers? So anybody can really answer.
I think that students we should have as many resources as possible for students to have a way to enter into this conversation in the way that they're comfortable. So I think that an ideal situation is, and I'm speaking from the time, the number of years I was coordinator of Asian American Studies programming, our intent was really to try and devise multiple ways for students to be part of this conversation. So we, for instance, had an undergraduate research symposium. So that was an opportunity for students who had been in certain classes to present their research during in the month of April. And this could be something from the fall semester or the spring semester. And those are sort of students who had been taking classes. And we also had the living learning community, where these are students who wanted to just take a 1.5 credit class. We also had a kind of a more kind of academic programs that featured the work of faculty. We also had cultural programming and co-curricular programming, and those things still exist. So I think that what we need is kind of a menu of, or an inventory of options for students to enter this conversation in ways that they're comfortable with. So not everyone in the audience is going to be taking, you know, a class with Professor Isaac or Professor Shallow or any other faculty, but they might want to take the living learning community with Mihyun and Haruki. So those are just different ways for students to enter this conversation. Other students may want to choose to be active in student organizations. They may want to develop programming on their own or with the AACC or with the Cultural Center Collaborative. So I think we just need to share that there's a lot of people on the faculty side and the professional staff side who are here to support you and who will help you as much as possible. I think it's up to you to also figure out what needs you have. So I can tell you that from our perspective, we can help support you if you're more specific in your demands. So a historical example would be from the cohort of students who made the demands around 2009. They wanted a cluster hire of a faculty working in Asian American studies. A cluster hire is meaning a hiring, a cluster, a number of hires in various departments so that there's at least a cohort of faculty who would come here at Rutgers who would have a sense of belonging. Those students also demanded a kind of an institute for Asian American studies, and they wanted a learning community. And so when those of us who were involved at that point, when we discussed this, it was beyond our control to do hiring because that's budgets that are within the departmental constraints, that they have to move it up to the schools and they have to be approved higher up. And the same thing with an institute that costs a lot of money. But what was within our control was the establishment of a learning community. So anything that you can think of that is manageable, like think about, you know, what is really like the kind of low-hanging fruit that we can help you with, and then also the larger asks that we can also work towards. So I think those are the things that the students can do, and enter the conversation in whatever way you're comfortable with, whether it's a conversation amongst your family, with your friends, with your student orgs. Taking a class is always, always, always preferable because those are things that the deans see in terms of enrollment, whether it's even just breaking down some stigma and going to see TAM or Yushi, or encouraging your colleagues and friends to see TAM and Yushi who you know would benefit from their resources. So whatever way you enter that you're comfortable with, then you're doing your part in this larger effort.
I think I've mentioned it, I think, to Jillian and Emily, and you're absolutely right, Rick. I think students should actually enter the conversation in as multiple ways as possible, from family to their friends, to their courses, et cetera, et cetera. But I would also just advocate for you to advocate. That is to say, you are a minor or a major in some department, whether it's in the business school or the School of Arts and Sciences or in the School of Education or anywhere. And I think you really should just talk to your chair, because you are a major, you are part of that community. We are all part of many, many communities. And being a poli-sci or an econ major or a religion major or sociology or anthropology major means that you are part of that department. And being part of that department means they are responsible to you. They must respond to you. I don't think it should just be up to American studies or Asian languages and culture to actually create this program. It is up to every social science, it's up to every humanities department. It is up to even science courses. You know, there is such a thing as ethnomathematics and sort of other sort of sciences that actually are not necessarily about the West. And I think these are very important. You are part of your own departmental community, demand things from them. They must respond. And then the worst that they can say is that we don't have it. Well, that's on them. That is in fact their own embarrassment. If you have not worked after 30 years or whatever it is, you know, my department is what, 50 years old, celebrating, it's like, and we have responded to it, you know, so, and the departments are even older than that. So therefore they must respond now.
I would love to give a little bit more context to what Professor Isaac said. We at Asian Student Council have been spending about the last month reaching out to different academic departments. And like Professor Isaac said, there are the pretty obvious ones. There's English, there is business, there is communication, but there are the ones that are a little more nuanced that you don't really recognize. And that is another way that you can be involved. You all have come to this event and you've established that you are here as an ally or as an APIDA individual interested in making a change at Rutgers. And like Professor Shallow said, there is no one way to advocate. There is no one way to be an ally. So we want to explain that with what we've been doing at Asian Student Council, we've been reaching out to departments and we've been stating that this is something that is expected of you. Departments, this is something that you need to get going on. It's 2021 and it's something that isn't really a byproduct of students coming forward and speaking whatever they want to say. It's something that we demand and that we deserve simply for existing. So to give a little bit more context, the reason why, as we are reaching out to departments and stating that this is something that you need to do, we've been doing this as part of the Asian American Studies Initiative, which Professor Isaac and Professor Lee have spoken about. And we invite students to join Asian Student Council and join the AACC and join many other student organizations who are mobilizing their APIDA voices, the MAV Coalition. There are so many other opportunities for students to get involved, and it doesn't need to be in one form. Like Professor Lee said, not all students are going to be able to take a course. So we encourage you to go see Tam at CAPS and break that APIDA stereotype of mental health. So we really want to emphasize that there are many options for you, and there are so many ways that you can get involved depending on how you can contribute. What is your capacity? What is your goal? So we definitely have those options for you, and we will surely share them with you once we get to the end of this event and follow up with the contact information and recording. So thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives on the questions that we asked. We know we hit you with a lot, but it's nothing that you can't take. You all answered so eloquently and so gracefully and so informatively. But for right now, we're going to switch over to the student Q&A portion. So we know that we have a ton of students in the audience, be it APIDA or allies, and we love to hear from them as to what questions they have based on what they've heard from today or other questions that they've developed based on the panelists' backgrounds and other personal experiences. So please, students, feel free to send your questions into the chat and we'll be able to read them and deliver them to the panelists. Okay, I see one question from Mufi from the AACC, and he asks, do you think having a town hall with upper administration will be helpful to find solutions to achieve a permanent space for the AACC and much more endeavors for the APIDA community in the future? That's something that I would like to pose to Mihyun or maybe Professor Isaac or anybody else if they'd love to comment.
So I think that this touches on something I mentioned before in terms of things that are within our control, more within our control, and other things that are more within the purview of the larger administration. I think any kind of conversation with other faculty and university leaders is good conversation. I just would encourage the students to really be clear in what your what the kind of conversation that would be. So I think that, you know, the kind of a drawing really tight connections between what you see are the needs of a physical space of the Asian American Cultural Center in relation to this kind of academic space of Asian American studies, like trying to draw those connections clearly, or whether it's more resources and caps, like really being clear as much as possible on what is on the page in creating this town hall. And I think they're all really important priorities, and they may all be related, but they may not all be related in the same way or heard in the same way by the administration. So you just have to be very clear in the kinds of demands that you have, that when you're staging this kind of town hall or a kind of public forum.
I think a representative actually, oh, so sorry, Professor Shallow. Okay. I always find that actually that small group of meetings, direct meetings with direct conversations, rather than a public forum, is more effective when we're talking about it to administration and higher administration. I think having a representatives plural, you know, usually like 4 or 5 students, being very clear about the 3 things that you want. 1, 2, 3. Can you do this? When can you do it? Because that actually is more effective to get a response than a public sort of like, you know, town hall. You know, I think you should have demonstrations for sure. I think you should have demonstrations outside the offices. But I'm sure, but as far as getting an answer, I think it's absolutely having a meeting that is formalized and actually have very particular points of demand and a timeline demand. That is actually will get you stuff. You
know. I was going to add to that a town hall is only useful if it's echoing what the administration is hearing in those small meetings. And, you know, actually each department was asked to submit a report about 2 weeks ago on its diversity initiatives and with its you know, goals. And one of the things we actually wrote up in Asian Languages and Cultures was, you know, why doesn't the AACC have a permanent, nicer space? And so if the administration is hearing that from departments, if it's hearing it from smaller meetings, if it's then hearing it from a town hall, it kind of, it all has to come together. So a town hall without that, what would you call it, like the groundwork or the preparation might not be that useful. But in the context of all these other things being done and coming together, then I think a town hall could, you know, have a useful purpose.
So it's clear that having a town hall is beneficial, but there also needs to be that intimate conversation with administrators who have a lot of power when it comes to making these great decisions. Like Professor Shala said, you need to have actionable items. You need to have specific things. Conversations are great. Starting dialogues is great, but it needs to go forward from there. It can't just continue being an echo chamber where we all talk about what we want, but there isn't a specific plan. There aren't specific goals and timelines that we have to develop that we follow, and we see results arise from that. So thank you, Mufi, for answering that question, asking that question. Oh, okay, another question in the chat. Are there specific action items that students can take in the next few weeks to help support the APIDA movement on campus? And I would love to pose that question to Mihyun.
Yeah, so as some of you know, through the work of AACC as well as ASC and the MAP Coalition, there's been a solidarity statement that's been drafted by undergraduate students listing both academic as well as student affair goals that they would like to see achieved in the coming days. So I think it would be great if everyone, you know, and this is for undergrads as well as grad students, community members, alumni, faculty, staff members to all sign up and show support, so that I believe the students will be bringing this to administrators so that they can show and, through the numbers of signatures, very well represent to administrators the number of support that from all aspects of Rutgers community that it has gotten support from. So please sign on to this. And I think Jillian will speak more about it at a later point, sometime before this event ends. So that's something that you can work on. Also, I think, within the next few weeks, I think that would probably be the only thing, considering that the semester is quickly ending. But in the future, if you are here next in the fall semester, we hope to do more, have more visible things, such as a sit-in or an occupying of a quad space. I think it's really impactful to see Asian bodies, right, occupying Voorhees Hall, the quad area, let's say, something like that, or maybe the area outside of the old Queens College, where the Board of Governors meet, and there's definitely different locations that this can be held, but these will all be sort of thought through during the summer, and will be forthcoming in the fall semester.
Professor Isaac.
No, I Professor Tam.
Oh.
I was just going to add really briefly, this might address both questions that are in the chat. I think one thing that we each can all do is to continue to share our narrative, our stories. Share it with
I'm so sorry to interrupt, Tam, but would you be able to move your microphone a little bit? It's a little bit hard, and I think some people in the audience are having a hard time hearing you. Okay, so we'll put a pin in what Tam was saying, and we'll get right back to her.
I was going to add, so as far as the core members, I think it's very important for core members of MAV, of ASC, to keep the lines of communications with the administration and chairs that you've already have been in touch with this past semester, even just as a touch base, like, in June, July, and August. I mean, I know it feels like you're a bother. You should be a bother. That's okay. And I think that's also because administrators are supposed to work for 12 months a year. So to make sure, in a sense, that the communication lines are open, that's all I really mean, is that there is not a break in communication, and that you're always touching base every month until, we actually are physically together again, hopefully in September. And I think that's when, of course, the sit-ins, and I think all those demonstrations are very important for everyone to show up at. But really, I think the each member and the people who have been active this past couple of months should continue and make sure that those communication lines continue even through the summer with administration and upper administration.
And I would echo, if you guys haven't already thought about this, the main organizers is not only to continue to engage faculty and administrators during the summer months, but also keep the students engaged as well, so that there will be a kind of a momentum that can be kept up through the summer and into the new academic year. I think that's very, really important as well, because, as you know, it's imperative that this conversation keeps going and that it continues until your demands are met. So,
Tam, would you like to comment before we turn to our last student question?
Sure. Is this better? Did I sound like a robot before? That happens to my Zoom. So every time that happened, I just have to exit the room and come back in. So what I wanted to add was to continue to tell your stories, your own narratives. Those stories are so important. Whoever will hear it, they will hear it. Whoever will hear it, tell it to them. And if you can amplify other APIDA folks' voices and stories in any spaces that you can. I know on my end, we had for Women's History Month, where there was this assignment of, oh, everyone pick a woman and like send a blast out to the whole staff about whoever you want to. So I highlighted an Asian American woman and all her advocacy work, because I don't think people knew about her, right? So we have to try to amplify each other's voices and continue to tell others about our own narrative. As alumni, as current students, as faculty and staff, I think that's really, really important.
It's definitely clear that owning your own narrative is something that's essential to not only living your APIDA identity, but embracing it and having that trust within yourself. And I think that brings us to our last student question that asks, how can we as students in our own personal communities correct outsiders when it comes to stereotypes that are placed on us, on our racial groups, our ethnicities? How can we combat those stereotypes and those microaggressions? I know. Oh,
I
no,
can start. Yeah,
no,
I
no,
was
no.
just gonna say, I think this is why learning history is really important, because there are specific circumstances in which those stereotypes typically arise. And then by sort of explaining the situation behind the stereotypes, I think that's one way of combating that stereotype. Also, I would say by example, right? I mean, I don't know specifically what these stereotypes are that the student is referring to, but I mean, let's say, I mean, again, the stereotype that Asian APIDA is, we're not political enough. You can definitely counter that by your own actions, by showing them that you're involved in politics, you're active, you go vote every election, you are engaged in things on campus that show your activism. I think, I mean, again, knowing the history and then showing you yourself how you yourself as a defier of these stereotypes are, I think, sort of the best ways that you can correct outsiders of said stereotypes.
And as a mental health professional, I want to remind everyone that microaggressions are not micro by any means, so they can have compounding impact on all of us. And so to find communities and support. If it's something that continuously happens, find support, talk about it, write about it, draw about it, sing about it, whatever it is that you need to do, find support to take care of yourself, because it is not micro by any means at all.
It's incredibly clear how many ideas and how many opportunities are present at Rutgers, whether it's through your all departments and your offices. We'll be sure to include your contact information with our follow-up social media posts about this event. Unfortunately, we can't take any more questions because we're reaching the end of our event, but we will be sure to include that information for students who have questions and who have continuous questions about themselves and the APIDA community. We know that there's a very long list of items that are related to you as an individual and embracing your individuality as an APIDA student, but also contributing and participating in the activism and the advocacy when it comes to making Rutgers a more diverse and inclusive place. So in addition to our panelists' contact information, with our recording links and also the live transcript, we will be sure to include the essential ways that all of you, the audience members, can participate in. And when it comes to individual advocacy for your own rights and your own identity, and also on behalf of the demands of Rutgers students. So we want to thank you all again so much for attending this event. We want to thank the panelists so much for participating in this event and sharing their amazing wisdom when it comes to their personal stories and their personal lessons and what they've learned from their time at Rutgers. With that, I just want to remind everyone that we will be having the recording, like I said, and that'll be available soon. And also, when this event ends, we hope that you will reach out to the AACC and the ASC's social media platforms. We encourage you all to follow us on Instagram and Facebook, as well as the AACC. We'll be sending that into the chat right now. And lastly, feel free to email our panelists with questions, because we've met all of them and they're all such amazing, such giving people, so generous with their knowledge and their time. So be sure to reach out to them if you have those questions and you have unanswered questions about this topic and APIDA identity. So with that, I want to thank you all again so much for attending this event. And yes, there is the social media handles in the chat. So I'll give you all a couple seconds to copy them before the event closes. And we'll also be posting the information that we mentioned, in case you miss it, on the Asian American Cultural Center social media and Asian Student Council social media, so you don't, in case you miss this in the chat. All right, I know it's been a very long night, but thank you all so much for participating in this conversation. And we hope that you have an amazing rest of your night. And we hope that you take away some really amazing thoughts and lessons from this conversation that we had tonight. So with that, I know I've said that 3 times, but final with that is everyone have a good night.